afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the NTMA CBIZ webinar series. Glad you could be with us today. To maximize the audio quality of the webinar, all of the attendees have been muted. So if you have any questions or comments during the webinar, please use the question box on the right of your screen, and there will be a Q&A at the conclusion of the webinar. Today's webinar title is Managing the Risks and Rewards of Your 401k Plan. It is presented by Ed Hinders. Ed is the Vice President and Senior Plan Consultant for CBIZ Retirement Plan Services. He has over 40 years of experience in the retirement and employee benefits industry, primarily assisting plan sponsors in the management of fiduciary responsibilities. He is a thought leader in the industry, an experienced speaker and presenter of public seminars. He and his team have been recognized by PlanSponsor.com as one of the best retirement plan advisory teams in the United States. Ed holds the Series 6 and 63 security licenses and the Series 6.5 investment advisor representative license. He has also earned the accredited investment fiduciary professional designation awarded by the Center for Fiduciary Studies. So I'd like to turn the program over to Ed. Thank you, Ed.
Well, thank you, Pam, and thanks for the opportunity to visit with the attendees today to spend a little bit of time together talking about one of the most important benefits that the attendees and many of the NTMA members are offering their employees around the country today, and that is their 401k or retirement plan. So today, mainly today, we're going to be talking about some concepts that have to do with what we call defined contribution plans. And so when we talk about defined contribution plans, typically in the precision manufacturing industry, that's going to really be typically a 401k plan. So I suspect that most of the attendees today have a 401k plan. And, you know, when I look at these programs today, over the years with my background, I think with some risk management training that I had early in my career, and then as I evolved in my career, spending more time with the benefit side of these types of plans, I think I recognized that really for plan sponsors, for those of you that are on the phone today, and now, you may not personally be considered what might be the plan sponsor. You know, you're representing your company. The company might be the plan sponsor, or you have a trustee that would be a plan sponsor. But mainly the entity and the parties involved with the employer are really considered the plan sponsor. So I look at that and see kind of two sides of the equation, because over the years, the responsibilities, or we'll call it the fiduciary risk for these plans, has really grown. And so I look at that fiduciary aspect of being a plan sponsor as carrying some risk to it. So we're going to talk today a little bit about the risk side of these plans, sponsoring plan, but we're also going to talk about how managing that risk, I think, really helps to improve the benefit side of this equation, and making this offering that you have, these 401k plans, really a better benefit for both not only the employer as a plan, but also for employees. So Pam was kind enough to give you a little background on myself. The firm I work for, CBIZ Retirement Plan Services, we are a national firm. We are also a national corporate associate member of NTMA. I am based here in St. Louis, so we also regionally I spend time working with local NTMA chapter here in St. Louis and Kansas City, and have kind of over the years developed some relationships across the country with NTMA members. So my firm is involved in advisory work, which really looks at investments and some of the things we're going to talk about today, and administration, and also does some actuarial work, although that's not something typically I see too much of in the 401k world. As Pam mentioned, I do have a background in that risk management, employee benefits world, and again, helping clients really kind of bridge the gap, I would say, to these kinds of programs. So I thought maybe as we get started here today, it might be helpful to kind of, maybe define a few terms that we're going to be referencing today, because I think it'll help kind of pull this all together. And so ERISA and then fiduciary and governing bodies are really going to be some of the things we're going to visit on. So let's start with ERISA, which is a term that is bandied about quite a bit in the benefits world, and it stands for the Employment Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. That was really, at that point in time, one of the most major legislation pieces that came out of Congress that really covers how employee benefit plans are managed and just many of the standards and the requirements. So under ERISA, under that umbrella, qualified retirement plans come into play. And so at that time, the federal law really began to set some minimum standards that were going to be applied, because we were talking at that point about some pretty important issues with regards to management of participant accounts in terms of dollars that they're trying to save for retirement. So it does set some minimum standards that employers and plan sponsors have to follow. And it also requires plans to, really kind of interact with their participants, I would say, in terms of providing them with plan information. It also sets some minimum standards for participation, things like, how old do you need to be to come into the programs? Typically, we see like age 21 as being kind of an entry point, or maybe younger than that. Also, standards for participation could include things like hours worked or how long do you have to be with the company before you're eligible to participate into the program. So those are all figured out later. We'll talk a little bit about how you actually set those parameters. And then vesting, that word vesting, another common word for that would be ownership. And so as the employer is making some contributions into the plan, typically when our employees vested into those plans, those are all defined under the regulations. And then it also laid out some very important fiduciary responsibilities for those who are managing and controlling these plan assets. So we talk about those responsibilities applying to both the company, maybe the owner of the company, the president of the company, but it also comes down to those folks who are actually touching the plan, managing and controlling it. So that could actually, come into the HR area, maybe the finance part of the company, or even if you've been to the point where you've actually formalized maybe an internal committee with the organization, those parties would also have some fiduciary responsibilities. And it's not really a title thing. It's not one of those things where you just have that responsibility because of the title of the company, but it's really more of I would call it more of a functional responsibility. So certainly owners and presidents of companies can delegate authority. Ultimately, they are a fiduciary, even though they're delegating that. But it really is, it's how are you interacting, kind of when the plan, how the plan works. So ERISA also required plans to establish some sort of a grievance and appeals process for participants to get benefits from their plans if there were any serious problems with the plan. And it also gave participants really under the law the right to sue for benefits and any breaches that would occur of fiduciary duties. So what we're seeing there today in the marketplace, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is in the last number of years, quite a bit of increase in what we would call 401k litigation by maybe class action lawsuits by participants who are suing their employers for maybe a lack, maybe not necessarily a breach, but what I would say is maybe a lack of paying attention to certain things that they're required to pay attention to. So I see most of those litigation cases today kind of being in the area of fees and fees and expenses, and then particularly maybe in the investment area. So we typically don't see much of that in the smaller marketplace, but the Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, when those lawsuits are established and some of the judgments are coming out of those over the last number of years, those are kind of setting some of the standards that I think some of you folks are actually seeing if you're involved into your plan. So the next thing we're going to try to define is fiduciary. So it's that word that you hear kind of bandied about, but if you look at it kind of in its basic form, someone who's legally responsible for managing or handling someone else's money would really be considered a fiduciary. So One of those responsibilities, of course, when you're responsible for working with someone else's money, is just making sure that decisions that are made for those participants are really being made in their best interest. So ERISA really lays out some pretty strict, definitions or guidelines in terms of what fiduciaries need to do in their roles, and it actually kind of bleeds into certain areas such as plan management, plan assets of the plan, administration of the plan, making sure that the plan is operating the way it was set up. And also a really important area would be in the area of investment advice to the plan. So again, these plan fiduciaries are going to include many folks, the trustees, the administrators, plan investment committee personnel, those types of folks. So in terms of fiduciary responsibilities, definitely acting in the best interest of the employees. Oftentimes when I'm working with committee members at a firm, I kind of remind folks that are on that committee that they're really wearing a couple of hats. They're wearing the hat of the employer, because the employer certainly has to be taken into consideration in terms of financial impact on their plan and on the employer itself. But they also sometimes have to take that hat off and put on the hat of employee and make sure that they're looking at the plan and governing the plan through the eyes of the employee. Because really, at the end of the day, the only reason the employer really provides the plan is for the benefit of the employees. And then some areas where you look at investments and making sure you're selecting those investments prudently and monitoring those investments, and at times if an investment isn't working properly, removing or replacing those options. This is where I find a lot of plan sponsors or those that are responsible for this have maybe passed that on either to their current investment advisor, or if they're not working for an investment advisor, have really kind of leaned on their service provider, the company that they have their 401k with. One of the important differentiators, though, there is that oftentimes that particular service provider is not able to act as an investment fiduciary to the plan. Some of that may be changing down the road here a little bit, because we've got some new Department of Labor regulations that have been proposed. And, hopefully we're going to see some finality on that. Those have actually been put a bit on hold under the new administration, but we do hope to see some clarity on some of those, statutes, I guess, coming up here. So, and then the last couple here is just making sure that fees are considered reasonable. That word reasonable within the area of fiduciary responsibilities is pretty broad term. We're not saying that you have to have the lowest price, and certainly having the highest price isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just that does that price that you're paying and ultimately what your participants are paying, is that being tied to services being provided that are considered reasonable? So at the end of the day, you just have to be able to make that determination that the fees of the plan are being calculated on a reasonable basis. And then lastly here, plan sponsors do have some responsibilities in terms of when they offer this plan, is to also educate their participants. And oftentimes they're leveraging many of their service providers, whether it's the record keeper that they're using, such as a Fidelity or Prudential, et cetera. And also maybe their local, advisor who is working with them and educating their participants through various ways. So that kind of tees up, I would say, some of those responsibilities. And then I thought I might share a little bit here in terms of who's looking over your shoulder or over the shoulder of the service providers that you're working with. And of course, the two primary governing bodies for these would be the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, and then also the Department of Labor. The IRS and the Department of Labor are really looking over and looking out on behalf of your participants, and they're really they're looking closely at the activities of the plan sponsors, making sure that the plan sponsors are running the plans correctly. And there are times when plan sponsors may fall a little bit outside of their guidelines. Maybe they fail to do something that is required by the regulations. And at that point, there are processes that you as an employer can go through to kind of get square with the IRS or with the Department of Labor. There's different types of voluntary correction programs. But, you know, if in your administration of the plan you notice something that may be a problem, it really is probably best to first, you know, bring this to the attention of, you know, the trustees and the plan sponsor. Possibly look at talking to your outside ERISA counsel, and then getting some guidance on how to best work with the IRS and the Department of Labor, because what you don't want to see happen is issues that are identified that are left unattended, because there can be some serious fines and penalties that can come from those regulating bodies. The other two areas, FINRA and Securities and Exchange Commission, I see them probably a bit more overseeing the investments side of the equation, FINRA being that entity that's overseeing the investment advisors that you're working with, making sure that they're properly licensed and that there's good disclosure on their integrity and the way they are operating their businesses. And then, of course, the SEC is looking over the managers of your investments, so it could be the Vanguards of the world and the Fidelities and the American funds and the various entities that you're kind of dealing with there. So just trying to keep yourself within the general guidelines of those organizations. So we're going to cover today a little bit on the 6 primary areas of fiduciary responsibility that we've identified here at CBIZ. And we're going to take a look at each one of these areas. And I don't want you to look at this webinar today as all about compliance and responsibilities. But I will say that as we look at these areas, these are all really important areas that if these are being actually handled properly from a fiduciary standpoint and a responsibility standpoint, these actually then translate into making your plan a more valuable plan for your participants and a more valuable plan for the plan sponsor in terms of recruiting and retention of your participants. So these 6 areas, we're going to kind of do just a little bit of a deeper dive and get through this for you. So in the first area, compliance and administration, I just have 4 items listed here: plan documents, discrimination testing, timely contributions, and plan and participant notices. The reason I've highlighted these, and there are others that are of importance, but these are 4 of the ones that we tend to see some of the areas where we see problems. So your plan document, when you sit down and work that out with the service providers that you're working with, there's really about 3 ways to do this today. We have what's called a prototype document that is a pre-approved IRS document that basically you can say, look, if we're going to kind of operate our plan in a box here and we feel pretty comfortable with that box, you can basically just adopt that prototype plan document, and it's already pre-approved with the IRS. You really don't have to do much more, and then you just amend it a little bit and kind of add some customization to it. There's a couple of other document approaches, volume submitter document where you want to maybe get a little bit more outside of the box, and then also a customized document. Some of those paths have to then go to the IRS for approval and can be a little bit lengthy in terms of time. My main message here is, though, is if you have decided on a plan document and you've got a roadmap basically on how to operate your plan, it's really, really important to make sure you're following the document and not ignoring some of those types of requirements. Discrimination testing, this is something you may be familiar with if you have a plan already, and this is some annual testing that is done by your compliance service provider, and really designed to really kind of make sure that the plan is serving all employees and not just the highly compensated employees or the owners of a company. And it's just a way to make sure that the plan is kept in balance, and that's done through various testing approaches. And there are ways for plan sponsors to actually remove themselves from some of those discrimination tests, which we'll talk a little bit about more later. And you can certainly look at the wide variety of ways to do your testing. Timely contributions, very important when contributions by your employees are separated from their paychecks and you're aggregating those and sending them into your record keeper, which ultimately is going to get those out into the investment market. Really, really important to do that in a timely manner. Very similar to when you separate your withholding taxes and forwarding those on to the taxing authority. It's extremely important to make sure that those contributions for your 401k plan are separated and sent to your service providers as quickly as you possibly can. There really is no quote-unquote standard. I mean, we do hear some time frames out there in terms of being minimum standards sometimes. But really, if there's ever an audit of this, the audit is really going to be based on how quickly can you do that and how quickly can you turn it in, and that is your standard. So if you start finding that there's a float time there, that can create some problems, and that can be reported back up to the Department of Labor, and actually, depending on your reporting status, can actually become public information. So you really want to watch making sure that you're getting your contributions separated and out pretty quickly. And then plan and participant notices. Very important to make sure that you're getting your annual plan notices out. Anything that relates to maybe changing investments or any sort of fee disclosure notices that you're required to send out. Our firm tries to put together like a kind of a monthly checklist of those kinds of things, because unfortunately they don't all happen at the same time each year. You will see more notices being required, toward the end of the year, which kind of tee you up for the January 1st of the following year. But there's different times during the year where certain types of notices have to be released. So it is kind of hard to keep that all organized, and it's kind of good to have maybe a little bit of a checklist on that. Another area is the fees and expenses. This is a very important part of oversight by a plan sponsor. Kind of broken that down into three categories here: your investments, your compliance and administration, and your record keeping. And I would say, as far as investments are concerned, one of the things you have to understand is that investments, even in the retirement world, kind of come in different price points. And we call those share classes. So you can either dial up or dial down the cost of your investments. And I would say one of the important things there, I think, as a plan sponsor, is making sure that you're first of all aware of what those internal expenses are. The transparency of getting those expenses in front of you and in front of your participants. And then once you're aware of that, making some sort of determination that those fees and expenses are reasonable, and how do you do that? Well, it's going to require you, or maybe your advisor, doing some benchmarking for you and comparing your plan to maybe averages in the industry for a plan of your size, or maybe actually sending out what might be called a request for information quote, which is sometimes maybe a blind comparison, where you're actually lining up your fees and expenses for investments to the fees and expenses of maybe 2 or 3 other firms that might compete for your business. So I think our industry has made some pretty good strides in the last number of years in terms of transparency, getting all this data out. Unfortunately, I feel like sometimes we, as an industry, we have a tendency to do a lot of data dumping. So you or your participants are handed quite a lengthy document of information, and unfortunately it gets set aside sometimes. And so I think getting some help to find out what those expenses are, summarizing them, making them clearly understandable is really, really important for you and your role, and then also for your participants. The last one there, revenue sharing, in terms of seeing if any of the expenses of your plan are actually being shared with other service providers. This was a very common practice in the past and continues to even be a practice today. Our firm believes that really costs for the various elements that we're talking about here should be kind of separate and looked at independently, so that you can negotiate those out individually. So the compliance and administration piece, again, benchmarking who is doing your third-party administration kind of work that you need for testing and plan document work. Maybe looking at whether your compliance, your TPA is actually bundled in with your record keeper. Sometimes your record keeper will do both record keeping and your compliance administration. And then other times I have clients that actually separate that out and find a local third-party administrator or a firm like CBIZ who will actually do that independent of the record keeper. Really no different than investments. From time to time, you really need to kind of benchmark pricing on that. And I would also say make sure you're working with someone who really has some experience. Check out their qualifications, their experience, number of clients they have. You want to have high confidence there, because that is a very, very important part of your program, making sure it's working correctly. And then the record keeping, I mean, I think from the standpoint of giving you some examples here, types of providers in the marketplace, I typically find this to be kind of broken down either into the major insurance companies in the marketplace. Those could be firms like Prudential, maybe Mass Mutual, maybe Voya. There's various really significant, insurance companies out in the marketplace. And then investment firms, you'll see firms like Fidelity or T. Rowe Price or American Funds maybe also offering 401k platforms that you can look at. Both are going to kind of get you to the same point. They just kind of come in different flavors, and you really have to kind of compare and contrast what might be best for your organization. And then lastly, custom built, you'll find an independent organization that'll build out the record keeping and compliance and do what we call as an open architecture approach, which just basically opens up the investment platform to hold not just proprietary investments, but any kind of investment manager that you want to put on there. And so as you're working with your service providers, it helps to do it that way. So one of the reasons we look at these fees is because it's so important to understand that the impact of these higher fees on individual retirement accounts can be pretty significant. And so in this case, we've got a couple of people, if we just use some arbitrary numbers here and said they had, for example, $20,000 in their account, and they were both age 40 and they were going to retire at age 60 in about 20 years. And let's say they're both growing their portfolios pretty much at the same clip at 7.5% maybe a year on average. But here Jackie and Jason, but Jackie's paying she's paying 1% less in those asset-based fees a year. And so what's happening here, that impact of the lower fees, if she is paying, let's say 0.5%, and Jason's paying 1.5% for those fees, you can see here that just that fee differential for her is going to result in about $13,000 more in retirement savings in 20 years than her counterpart. So same performance, same investments, same, but just difference in fee factors. And so that's why this is so significant for folks over a lifetime. It can actually mean into the tens of thousands and sometimes even to hundreds of thousands of dollars of more money available to you and your participants in retirement. So pretty important area today. So then from an investment standpoint, I think we've talked quite a bit about this here. It's really just about kind of like the due diligence and the process that you go through, this idea of kind of approaching it from a prudent expert standpoint. That word prudent kind of is, really kind of comes down to being familiar with these matters. So we have a lot of folks on the phone here that represent employers that are very, very good at precision metalworking and creating a part or a product and getting it to market. And it's very precise, and they know exactly what they're doing, and they've got quality control and all of that. But when it comes to investment, they may not be as skilled. So sometimes employers today will actually, in fact, consider engaging an outside investment advisor if they're not using one, and someone who can actually come into the partnership and actually provide services under ERISA as what we call a 321 or a 338 investment advisor. And this is where that party is actually signing on through their contract with the plan sponsor to be a fiduciary to the plan, either a co-fiduciary or the sole fiduciary to the plan with regards to investments. So in that process, you want to be looking at things like, are you focused on the number of funds you have or the quality of funds? So our firm is really looking at quality versus quantity, because the more investments that you're putting out there in front of your participants, first of all, it makes it harder for you to monitor those, But secondly, it really causes sometimes a lot of confusion. And with confusion will come inaction. Folks will just not, they just kind of freeze up and they won't make good, investment decisions. So quality is extremely important, and you don't need 80, 90, 100 funds in your lineup to meet that to meet what you're trying to do. The other word that we use here is open architecture, meaning trying to get multi-managers of funds, trying to bring in the American Centuries, the American funds, the Fidelities, the T. Rowe Prices, the Vanguards, trying to get a blend of those kinds of money managers because they all do things slightly different. And then also offering maybe a combination of actively managed funds versus what we call passively managed or index options, because you have a couple of different types of participants out there in terms of their buying styles of their investments. And you want to be sure you're giving them, both sides of the house kind of options to meet their goals. And then what kind of fund do you use for your default fund? Is it a target date fund? Is it a balanced fund? Or is it a managed account program? These are all three items that are approved by the Department of Labor as qualified defaults. Target date funds being a very, very popular approach. Basically, it's an age-based diversified fund option that in most cases is designed to be more aggressive when an employee is early in their career and becomes more conservative as they get older and approach retirement. So not uncommon to see someone in their 20s being maybe 100% invested in the stock market in these types of funds. But once they get out to about retirement age, might only be about 50% invested in the stock market. So all of those funds, they're not created equal. And so if you have a fund in your program, a target date fund, you want to be sure you understand the construction of it because there's different costs, different performance, and different what we call glide paths for those programs. Another area here that we're talking about is participants. And so just at a high level, general education that you're trying to provide your participants, maybe that's being done by your record keeper, possibly could be done by your advisor. Typically maybe a little lunch and learn or just a couple times a year, someone coming in and providing some general education on the program. Taking advantage of web-based resources. When I first got into the business years ago, there was really no such thing as web-based resources. There was very little available to a participant to go and access a library of information on the internet. But with the technology we have today, most of your service providers have a pretty rich web-based approach to providing self-serve resources for participants. The problem with it is oftentimes, they build these systems, but folks are a little bit hesitant to go out and actually use them. So even some training, some education on how to use the web tools for the service providers that you're working with, really, really important thing to do. Thirdly, these gap analysis tools, again, technology driven, very important because it's all been about accumulation over the years. How much money am I building in my 401k account? But at the end of the day, it's not about how much you have. It's about really, is it going to meet your needs? And you really don't know until you do some sort of a gap analysis. So those folks that are going to be, retiring, if maybe they're eligible for Social Security, they're going to have a certain amount of income coming from that. They may have some income coming in from outside sources. Maybe they even have a certain amount of 401k assets that are going to provide some income. But if they're mid-career, they've really got to do that gap analysis and say, look, is my 401k strong enough to fill the remaining gap? Because really the goal is to try to have some target number of your, pre-retirement income available for, and it's a combination of a variety of sources. So those are really, really good tools that I think are out there today. And then delivery of investment advice. How do your participants get investment advice? Are they going through their record keeper? Are they going through a managed account program? Are they working with their advisors? And then what are the costs related to that? Some firms will build in investment advice as part of their core offering to being the advisor for the program. Others are going to charge a certain amount of cost, maybe based on the amount of assets that they're managing for a participant. So you just got to flesh out the benefits of that investment advice as well as the cost for those types of things. One of the areas I think is really most effective is one-on-one meetings. I know that means basically stepping away from a machine, or it means stepping away from what responsibility you have. but from time to time, maybe allowing your advisor to come in onto the property and have one-on-one meetings for 15 or 20 or 30 minutes with an employee to talk about their own financial planning with the 401k plan. Probably the most productive thing that most advisors and participants do. But it's time sensitive, and we recognize that not everyone can just step away from the CNC machine and go in and talk about retirement. But if you can find a way to do that, I think it's a high value item. Managed accounts, basically a way to get some investment advice, optional usually for participants, where they can pay a slight fee. And to me, it's like anything else in life. If you're going to pay a little extra fee, what am I going to get back in return? And generally speaking, the managed account certainly cannot promise any kind of future performance guarantees. It's an obvious thing, but typically they are taking a very disciplined approach of diversification, and from time to time even looking to move a participant in or out of the market based on economic conditions and things like that. So having somebody watching that 365 days a year can be worth a small investment. And then the last thing, I'm not sure if you can actually see it on your screen there, financial fitness and wellness, really something that's been catching on around the country, because this 401k is it's one component part of financial fitness and wellness. One of the challenges a lot of younger folks getting into the workforce today is student debt, student loans, and while you're trying to pay back student loans, it just doesn't, it's harder to save for retirement in the early years, which is really one of the most important parts of getting going in these kinds of programs. So just overall financial wellness and those types of things all of those things should be part of your education policy statement as an employer. And then from a governance standpoint, pretty high level here, just what I would say, the words like process, just making sure that you've got this process laid out, just like you do for the manufacturing side of your organization. And then documentation, making sure that you've written down the things you're doing. Have you formed a retirement committee? Very important to do that. Have a cross section of employees that are part of that. It doesn't have to be a big group, and you don't have to meet that often, just maybe a couple, 2 or 3 times a year you meet, but you're bringing in maybe you're bringing in some folks in the financial area, maybe in the HR related area. You might be bringing in maybe someone off the shop floor. You might be bringing in somebody from the engineering department, but getting a small group of 5 or 6 folks to sit down from time to time, talk about the 401k plan, interact with your record keepers, interacting with your advisors. It's just good to have all those different eyes looking at the program, and you'll see some good things from that. The other item I would recommend is an investment policy statement. If you do not have one, talk to your attorney or maybe your service providers. Typically a firm like CBIZ, my firm, or other advisory firms in the country can help you by providing some generic committee charters and investment policy statements that you can generally adopt. And really that's nothing more than having kind of a roadmap on how you're going to manage the investment selections and any replacements of the funds that are out there. So the last thing you want to do, though, is have an investment policy statement and not follow it. So don't create one and put it in a file folder and not follow it. It's very important to just make sure you're following that. And then lastly, I would say just documenting things through some meeting minutes, making sure that you have a secretary on the committee who's taking notes and producing something for the file. And then that's really good feedback to both the ownership of the company who's delegated that authority, and also in case you're large enough to have an annual audit, your auditors are typically going to want to see your meeting minutes. And then one of the last items here is what we call merger and acquisition and plan conversions. Merger and acquisition probably not happening too much in the world that we're talking about here, but from time to time, your firm may be bought or you're buying another firm, and so in a merger and acquisition situation, one of the things you want to be sure is don't wait until the last minute on an M&A to address the 401k issues, because it can be somewhat of a complicated process, and there is a lot involved in that. So if anyone's involved in that situation today, just kind of bring that up on the front burner a little bit. And then plan conversions. This would be where you're maybe moving from one platform to another, and I'm only going to use these names just for example, certainly not, I'm not providing any favoritism here. And I'm just saying, like, if you were going to move from Prudential, for example, over to Fidelity, or from Fidelity to Prudential or some other firm, those are what we call plan conversions. And I do see that as being an opportunity sometimes if it hasn't been done, and you can refresh your plan design. You can kind of look at how your participants are investing, maybe taking the assets of the plan, and rather than just moving them from a large growth fund to another large growth fund, is really kind of looking at maybe a re-enrollment into an option like the target date funds, and giving your folks an opportunity to opt out of that if they want to. One of the issues that I see is that sometimes we don't know how those investments have really been established on the left-hand side of the equation. And when we're moving them over to the right-hand side of the equation, is it kind of the old garbage in, garbage out? We just want to be sure the output is going correctly. And then lastly, with plan conversions, it is a bit of work and all of that, but sometimes a plan conversion can really improve what I call the water cooler buzz. When folks are standing by the water cooler and they're talking a little bit about the retirement plan, what's their conversation like? Is it positive? Is it kind of like lukewarm, or is it negative? So I really do think sometimes a well thought out conversion can really increase the positive aspect of the program and improve that water cooler buzz, as we talked about. One of the last things we're going to talk about here briefly is just what I call moving the dial. Different ways to improve your plan, some of the aspects of your plan. One of the areas would be in terms of employer contributions. Is this a plan that you have which is just employee deferrals right now, or are you as an employer putting in some matching contributions or maybe some profit sharing contributions? We do tend to see a little higher participation rate and contribution rate when there is some matching, or maybe an appreciation of a little profit sharing allocation. There are ways to kind of determine within your company what can the company afford to put into these programs, and then kind of back into the right kind of match or the right kind of a way to make that employer contribution. If you've heard of the word safe harbor really is kind of a term that we might generally recognize in this area as to whether some of those discrimination tests need to be performed on a yearly basis. And really the government kind of says, look, if the employer is willing to put a certain amount of minimum financial contribution into the plan, somewhere generally in the 3 to 3.5%, 4% of payroll a year, if the employer is putting that kind of contribution into the plan, then you can declare yourself a safe harbor, and you can maybe find ways to eliminate and remove restrictions that may be on some of the highly compensated folks, some of those ratios that are holding them back from being able to save enough money through the 401k plan. So that concept, to be or not to be, is just something we want to work with you to kind of help evaluate whether that was worthwhile or not doing it. And then vesting schedules, there's everything from immediate vesting that you give to your participants, that ownership of the money. There's a couple of other ones, a cliff of vesting, meaning there's no vesting for maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years, and then 100% vesting, or maybe a graded vesting, where the longer the person is with you, they get more and more ownership of the money that the employer is putting in. So maybe after 1 year, they're getting 20%, after 2 years, 40%, all the way out to maybe 5 years where they become 100% vested. So all different kinds of ways there that you can kind of, manipulate the guidelines of the program to serve, what your goals are as a plan sponsor. And then on the right there, the plan design best practices. This is what I'm seeing today in my day-to-day. I've really seen many, many employers automating their plan. Rather than having voluntary enrollment today, they're basically setting up automatic enrollment and saying, okay, once you've been here for 30, 60, 90 days, you're going to automatically be enrolled in the program. I see it all over the board, anything from maybe 1% to 10%. I've seen about the midpoint, 5 or 6% seems to be pretty common, maybe 3 to 6%. But basically getting folks in and having them make an election to opt out. We find that automatic enrollment probably will capture, and even once a few folks will opt out, anywhere from 85 to 95% will stick in the program. We also see automatic escalation today, usually 1% a year. So if you had an automatic enrollment at, let's say, 3%, and you had an automatic escalation of 1% a year, if someone comes in and lets the automation help them, in 7 years, they're actually saving 10% of their income, and they just kind of gradually ease their way into it. And that's getting into the range now of what they need to be saving to have a successful retirement outcome under these kinds of programs. And then automatic investing, the Department of Labor has approved these three: the target date funds, the balanced funds, and then also the managed accounts. And I would say that any and all of those will work well. But again, each employer has to kind of decide what is the best approach, for their participants. So kind of to sum up, the prudent process that we've been talking about, I've provided you with here basically a 9-step action plan of maybe kind of beginning to think about delegating those roles and responsibilities, establishing that committee that you could set up in your company, create the committee charter, defining those roles, responsibilities of those folks on the committee, create that investment policy statement. Typically, you're going to get some help with that through your investment advisor or your ERISA counsel. And then find a way to kind of perform and monitor the investments in the plan, the service providers, and be sure that you're even evaluating your registered investment advisor, making sure that they're taking a fiduciary status to the plan for the investment advice that they're giving to you. Make sure that you're maintaining compliance with ERISA and following your plan document. Document all the decisions you're making as you go through with your committee and the things that are impacting your plan. Make sure that you're spending some time, not every year doesn't necessarily be it, but generally I see it in the market every 2 to 3 to 4 years, benchmarking your services, benchmarking your fees and expenses, benchmarking your record keeper, benchmarking all of the service providers you work with. And then summarize all of this through your meeting minutes for communication to the board, to the president, to any entities such as auditors that are, looking over your shoulder a little bit for this. If you're looking for more information, I am including a slide here, and I know this is going to be recorded and out there for you later, but the Department of Labor, believe it or not, they've really got some pretty rich information out there, and at this website, just understanding the retirement plan fees and expenses. If you can go out to the DOL website and kind of dig down into the retirement section, they actually have put together what I would say is one of the best resources for plan sponsors to really kind of peel the onion on the fees and expenses of the program. So, this is all today about, managing the risks of offering these plans, but improving the benefits of the plan. And you really want to make the most of your plan. And quite frankly, I would encourage you to promote it as part of your overall compensation package to your employees, which it is. And, are you looking at your plan as a differentiator when you're using it for recruiting and retention? If everything is based on an hourly rate or, work conditions, those are all important things, but benefit-wise, is this something that's going to be a differentiator when you're trying to bring a new talent? And I know how hard all of you on the phone are working today to bring talent into your industry. So I think the other side benefit is you're going to have more financially secure employees if you have the right kind of 401k plan, and they're certainly going to be a better employee from a productivity and morale standpoint, I believe. And so important is that it's very important to help your employees be able to retire when they're ready. As we age, it's undeniable that we face further health issues, energy levels, productivity, morale sometimes can come into play. So folks who are having to work longer than they really need to and want to, sometimes doesn't always work out in the end best for them or even for the employer. So getting them to that point where they can actually, kind of retire with grace and style is really a great thing. So, Pam, I think I'm going to just kind of stop there. We're right at about 50 minutes, and I'll just say thank you to everybody on the phone for the opportunity to visit with you. It's a lot of information. I have my phone number, my email address here if anyone is interested in reaching out to me at any point. But Pam, I'll let you decide and open it up if you have anybody that has questions or any comments that they'd like to make.
Okay. Right now I don't have any questions, but I do want to say that was great. Ed, thank you so much for your time and expertise. It's much appreciated. To the audience, the webinar has been recorded, and it'll be available to view on the NTMA website. Probably you should be there by Monday morning. Also, while you're on the website, take a look at some of the upcoming webinars that are also presented by CBIZ. On June 1st, we have tax credits and incentives maximizing cash flow by minimizing tax. And on June 14th, we have property tax and personal property tax and what you need to know. And again, Ed, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We appreciate it here at NTMA.
My pleasure, Pam, and thanks everyone on the phone for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.